Chicago faces an epidemic of gun violence. This year alone, more than 2,100 people have been shot, more than 400 killed.
The violence that we're seeing is really an epidemic. It's a public health crisis.
People have been using this analogy of crime as an infectious disease or crime as an epidemic for a long time. When politicians use it, they use it to sort of draw attention to these rates that are off the chart. What I tried to do, which I do think is unique, was figuring out, like, what does that actually mean? Because rates don't move. A rate doesn't shoot anybody. It's people that do that. 10 years ago, as part of a project I was working on with a street outreach worker and actually a prosecutor, and we were working on the same project, and one of the outreach workers asked me, so who's gonna get shot next? And I knew what he didn't want me to say was, well, it was gonna be a young male between 18 and 35, and there's a 30% chance of him being a gang. And so I sat down with stacks and stacks of sort of homicide and shooting records, and I started making by hand these sort of network diagrams. And I started thinking about, well, what applies in this case of gun violence and what doesn't? Crime and delinquency is a group phenomenon. There are some things that you do sort of on your own, but by and large, when people do these sorts of behaviors, it's as a collective. So if person A and person B, say, rob a bank together, they have a tie. And then if person B, at a different point in time, say stole a car with person C, they have a tie. And these different ties link together to create chains and cliques and clusters, and ultimately these very large networks that encompass large parts of geographic neighborhoods or even entire cities. Then what we would do is we would take victimization data, either from homicide records or from the morgue or from the public health departments, and we would layer those into the network. And then what we saw was the clumping and clustering of victims, which we actually didn't know what to expect. But what we find is that if you're in a network where people around you are being shot, that your victimization level skyrockets. Shootings form these chains and they cascade from one victim to another victim to another victim. And it's not that the shooting causes the other shooting, it's that people are connected in such a way that these consequences kind of unfold over time. And so when you put those things together, what it tells you is we know kind of where it's gonna happen within social network. We know when people are at elevated risks, and we actually know when it might happen. And now we're trying to piece these things together to see how we might leverage that for sort of intervention and prevention efforts. It's hard to read the newspaper when you're doing this type of work. One of the things you are constantly reminded of is that every one of those nodes in those networks is a real person. But it also reminds me why we're trying to do better. Even getting that number down a little bit means there's a little bit less trauma than before.